Hi everyone and welcome to One Autistic Person. Today I'm going to do a bit of autistic myth busting. Many people don't understand autism and this can lead to myths being created. Some are more benign misunderstandings that unintentionally add to stigma. Some are misconceptions based on entertainment, or it can be from somebody's biased thoughts based on a person's individual experience of autism. And sort of narrowing it down to a very small set of people that person may have come into contact with, and therefore not understanding the fact that it's a spectrum, and therefore everybody on the autistic spectrum is different. And some are harmful misinformation that suits certain narratives. That's happening quite often in politics with a lot of things, but autism is one of those things that is happening with a lot. And unfortunately, that does shape views of the way things are seen. And actually, it can also be perpetuated by poorly trained or out-and-out offensively disruptive medical professionals. Sometimes people within the medical profession can be poorly trained on autism, but also some people actively want to sort of stop people understanding more about it in the fear that there may be more diagnosis of it. And I do truly believe that for some people it is. And I do think the NHS is kind of falling within those realms at the moment. They're kind of actively trying to move away from diagnosis of autism because of the fact of the perception of how many people are autistic, as we'll get into later in the there are way more than 10 myths about autism, but it's a nice round number, and I'm trying to keep my video lengths down as I do have a tendency to ramble. So I'm going to have a look at 10 myths, and these are sort of the ones that I could think of that were the most common ones and the ones that I felt that were sort of the more interesting ones to cover. So let's have a look at myth number 1. So the first myth that I'd like to bust is autism is a disease. Some people think that autism is a disease. Some think that it should be treated, cured and prevented, which is just plain eugenics in my view. A bit early to be using those strong words in this video, but it's true. The only way of eradicating autism is by eradicating autistic people. So it is, by the very nature of it, eugenics, and the history of autism and the Asperger's side of things very much is weighted in eugenics. So I don't ever want us to go back to that, so we shouldn't be trying to find a cure. The truth is that autism is a neurodevelopmental condition. We still don't know what causes us to develop differently, but it is not something that can be cured by a pill or by therapy or by how some people like to do it with brute force through absolutely force masking. You have to fit in, you have to be what we expect you to be. We know that our brains are autistic from birth, actually during pregnancy, but we know definitely from birth that we are born with the developmental condition that we have. But it obviously develops individually based on both the natural development of our neural pathways, as I've just sort of pointed out, but is affected by our environment, making it an individual experience with common differences that can be assessed to confirm a diagnosis. Just because it is diagnosed does not make it a disease that can or should be cured. It is diagnosed as the world is not set up for us, and a diagnosis allows us to navigate that world just a little bit easier and allows us to communicate our needs and any adjustments that we may need. Curing autism is not possible. Eradicating it is not possible. I am happy I exist. I'm happy I exist the way that I do. Autistic people don't generally hate that they are autistic, but we may hate that the world doesn't suit our brain. It doesn't mean we want to change our brain, but it's likely why we are often trying to change the world, and a lot of the time trying to do work to try and change the world, and that we want to make things better. And that doesn't just sit with, we want to make it better for people who are autistic. Quite often we want to make it better for everybody and make it as easy as possible for everybody. Whereas I personally feel that society is set up to make it as difficult as possible for everyone, not just autistic people, but extremely difficult for autistic people. So autism, definitely not a disease, definitely not something that should or could be considered curable or preventable. Like I say, that is nothing less than eugenics. So let's have a look at myth 2. So myth number 2 is kind of my favourite, but for all of the wrong reasons. That vaccines cause autism. And it's not just, unfortunately, it's not just staunch anti-vaxxers that think this. It is something mistakenly thought that, that vaccines cause autism. The reason for this stems from a 1990s dubious study published in a journal that drew a very tenuous link, an extremely tenuous link between vaccines and autism, namely generally the MMR vaccine, the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine, which is also problematic in itself because it's meant that a lot more people are not getting their child vaccinated against measles, and that's mean we're having bigger measles outbreaks. And I don't think people really understand how bad measles is. And if I was to choose autism and measles, I would choose autism a million times over measles. It's a very, very bad illness. It's an illness that can cause death. It's not something that you want your child to have. So this study was not just below scientific standards, but it has been completely debunked due to being deceptive, and the physician was later stripped of their license. Unfortunately, due to fear and often a want for an explanation, as well as out-and-out malice, this has pervaded as true for decades. I think the statement "a lie gets halfway around the world before the truth has the chance to get its pants on" is really prevalent here, and misinformation. I think this proves misinformation has been around much longer than we've sort of known that it has been or thought that it has been, and this is an early and persistent example of this. A perfect example of how misinformation can get around and be seen as true if there's medical backing to it, or the fact that one paper says something. Oxford, I think it was either Oxford or Cambridge University, I can't remember which one it was, put out a fake study that apparently we swallowed X amount of spiders per year, and that is still for many people the truth. They a few weeks later came out, or a year later maybe, I don't know, it was a while later, came out and said this was completely untrue. We just wanted to see how the actual experiment was, to see how quickly false information could be passed around and how many people would believe it. And pretty much everyone did. I believed it until I read the retraction of it and the explanation for it. And I think that was really interesting. And this is a perfect example of that. And I think the problem with this is the spider situation wasn't damaging, apart from the fact I'm arachnophobic and I didn't like it reading it. But other than that, it was just uncomfortable. I didn't really think about it afterwards. This is actually making people choose bad decisions in relation to their children, because they're fearful that in their head something worse would happen than what the vaccine was there for. So, yeah, vaccines absolutely do not cause autism. They completely debunked, and it's present before any vaccines would be given. So let's have a look at myth number 3. So myth number 3 is autism is becoming an epidemic or a pandemic. And this is absolutely not true, but this is due to people talking more about autism, more support apparently being in place. I fail to see that support that's in place, but it is perceived that there is more support in place. Better understanding of diagnosis and more advocacy within and for the community has led to more diagnoses, but also more visibility of autism, which appears to be that more people are autistic to people outside of that community, when in fact it is just higher rates of diagnosis and more people who are diagnosed being confident to be open about it publicly. Also, the internet, as with many things, it means that one person can talk about autism on YouTube, for instance, and potentially that video could go out to anything from hundreds of people to thousands to millions of people. And therefore, more people are talking about it, more people are seeing it, and therefore, there is, if you're scared of something, then you then become paranoid about the fact that it's becoming an epidemic, when actually it's just people talking about it more, and there's nowhere near as many people talking about it as there have been diagnoses for many, many years. So it's just the more visible something becomes, the more people will believe that it is becoming epidemic. We need to ask ourselves, rather than asking ourselves and trying to deny diagnosis, we need to ask ourselves how many people struggle undiagnosed by the fact that it's not more visible. Rather than going, it's more visible, therefore it's a problem. Actually, it's not a problem of being more visible. It's actually a positive thing. And it also makes people who are already diagnosed feel that they are part of a community and feel that they're supported. And so it has many benefits. But it does also come with the negative side of it, where people want to make out that there's a causal link to it, that there's a cause for this, rather than it being actually this was always the case. People just were not being diagnosed. So let's have a look at myth number 4. So myth number 4 is that all autistic people have a savant skill. Not all. It's around 10% of autistic people who are thought to have a savant skill, meaning in layman's terms, a genius level skilled person on a specific area or areas of knowledge or creative skill. And it's often seen as it needs to be innate. It's something that's there naturally to that person, that it doesn't necessarily need to be learnt, picked up very, very quickly. It is learnt, but it's learnt at such a speed that people would think that they could naturally do it. Autism is a monotropic condition, meaning that we are able to focus all our concentration on one or a few subjects and know a lot about something due to our need to take in information on that subject. This can be misread as being a savant level skilled person, and I can see how that happens because I can know a lot about a very narrow amount of information on something where I've become hyper focused on it. Which, if I was talking to a person about it, they may feel like that I was a savant in that subject, but it's not. I've had to learn that. I've had to go through the process of learning it the same as anybody else. I may have got there quicker because I've hyper focused so much. But it's not the same as somebody going and spending, in people's eyes, it's not the same as somebody going and spending a lot of time on a degree on something and being able to come up with what would be perceived as the same amount of information. It isn't. The person with the degree will have more knowledge of that thing generally. And it's a misconception based on media and entertainment, but is often a misunderstanding of both autism as a spectrum and the requirements to truly be a savant person in a subject. So it's not understanding the fact of that innate ability, and there's a lot going on there that you would need to pass to be a savant in a subject. When it comes down to the autism spectrum side of things, I think there's a misconception from things like Rain Man, where people see that he had a savant ability with numbers and an ability to be able to count very quickly, and people see that as that is what all autistic people are, that their only experience. So let's have a look at myth number 5. So myth number 5 is something I've touched on quite a lot on my channel. So please go and have a look at other videos that I've done on this, because I find it absolutely fascinating, and I'm not going to go into a huge amount of depth with it. But people with autism don't feel emotion or empathy. So this comes very much down to the double empathy paradox. We of course feel emotion and empathy. We are human beings. We're not psychopathic. But we show it differently, which can be confusing to the onlooker. We are just as confused, and often feel neurotypicals have no empathy, or it appears that they lack empathy towards us. And emotions for neurotypicals can actually be really confusing to us. We're wrong in that situation. It doesn't mean they don't have emotion. It just means they're experiencing it differently. Also, a lot of people who are autistic also have alexithymia, which can mean that we have difficulty processing and understanding the emotions that we have. So therefore, when we are presenting those emotions, they can come across as confusing to people who don't have alexithymia, or even other people who do have alexithymia, because we're just not processing it in the same way. It doesn't mean we're not feeling it. We're just not able to necessarily name it. So we definitely do feel emotion and empathy, and quite often quite deeply. So it's a really, really bad misconception, because it's the exact opposite of what it is, really. So let's have a look at myth number 6. So myth number 6 is that all autistic people have an intellectual disability or can't speak. This comes again from a misunderstanding of what autism is, and the fact it is a spectrum. So some people require support with speech. Yes, they do. Do some people do some people who are autistic also require support intellectually? Yes. Do all? No. For me, this harms all people with disability, regardless of whether they are autistic or not, especially intellectual disabilities, because they are two separate comorbid conditions. They're diagnosed separately, and they are supported differently. So yes, you can be autistic and have an intellectual disability, and yes, you can be autistic and you have issues around speech, and therefore that can present in that way. But no, the two things do not need to be the case. Like I say, they can be comorbid and can often be, but it doesn't mean that is the case, and they are therefore separately either treated if there is a treatment for that comorbid condition, or supported if it's not a matter of treatment. So no, not everybody who is autistic has an intellectual disability or can't speak, but some do. Let's have a look at myth 7. So myth number 7 is one can grow out of autism. No, you can't. Autism, as I've already said, is a neurodevelopmental condition that is present from birth to death. Does it grow and change with us? Of course. It is the way our brain works, and our brain grows and changes over the course of our lives, depending on our experiences. But it doesn't autism does not fundamentally change with age. For me, I have actually grown into my autistic self as I have got older. Some would definitely say that it has got worse in their view. I say I have lost the ability to pretend that I am neurotypical. It does not get better with age because it wasn't bad in the first place. We are not the problem, society is, and that we have to remember that the way society is built. I'm not saying people are necessarily the problem, but the way society has been built over historical ways of us living and being told we should be living, which was very much pushed towards you have to live a certain way, not because it was the way that our brains needed to live, but it was the way that it was perceived that this was the best way to be a human being, and they were just perceptions. They were not actually truly the way that was good for us or beneficial to us. And there's a lot of things in history that aren't beneficial to us at all. But society still feels that we should act in certain ways and we should do things in certain ways, and that comes down to the fact that society is a problem. And that, I'm not saying people are a problem, but unfortunately people are part of society, but everybody lives within a society and lives within the rules of those, and therein lies the problem. But it's that idea of, if something was to get better with age, or that we were to grow out of something, it implies it was bad in the first place. And it's, yes, there are challenges with it, but it's not. But being autistic can be challenging, but it's not a bad thing. It's not an intrinsically bad thing. And I think that comes from a thought process that you would want to grow out of it. And it's this perception of the fact that autism is a child's condition. So let's have a look at myth number 8. So myth number 8 is that autistic people can't learn. And I think this comes from the perception of our rigid thinking and routine learning, and the fact we process information differently, which means that quite often teaching or training styles are not suited to us. We are not parrots. We can't pretend to be, and a lot of training and a lot of learning is around parrot fashion learning, and it's very difficult personally for me, and I know for a lot of autistic people it can be very difficult learning in that parrot fashion because you need to know more about things. And this can seem to an outsider that we are not learning, when in fact we are not being effectively taught or trained, and can indeed learn extremely quickly if our needs are taken into account. And once we learn something, we often do it to a really high standard and exactly the way we were shown, until we try and find a better way of doing it, and we'll try and change that. But until we were told differently, we will do it the way we've been shown, because that's the way we have actually learnt it. So we will do it actually more to the book generally than people maybe that are neurotypical, who might not do it at all, or might do it in a way that isn't necessarily the right way of doing it. So yes, autistic people can learn. We just learn differently, and it can look like we're not learning from people outside, because it can be frustrating. We're not seeming to pick things up in the same time and in the same way that they would expect us to. So myth number 9. So myth number 9 is a commonly held belief, and that is, or has been historically, that bad parenting can cause autism, which it can't. I think this comes from meltdowns being seen as tantrums, and that parents are judged on that. Meltdowns are not tantrums. Autistic children are not trying to get their own way. They are overloaded with their senses, are struggling with social interactions, and they are just generally overwhelmed when they're having a meltdown. Also, we often struggle to follow just because demands. So somebody says, we've got to do it, and just because. And as a kid, a lot of us really, really struggle with that. It's just because, but it's because we need to know why. Why are we doing this? If we've got to do this, why? And want to know why. And this is seen, especially in children, to be impertinent. And we should just follow demands regardless. And we just often don't. And quite often, to the parent's frustration that's being judged as a bad parent in that situation, they're probably trying really hard to get that child to follow their way of thinking, and actually an autistic child is going to really struggle with that and have sensory overload because a lot of those just because demands, just because I said so, actually the reason why we're asking about it and trying to not do it is because we're having a sensory issue around it. So if we're sensory overloaded and socially overloaded and everything around us is becoming challenging, of course we're going to have meltdowns. We have meltdowns as adults and we're going to have meltdowns as children. That's perceived as bad behaviour, as tantrums, and therefore it is seen that your child is not disciplined enough. Because we have a massive focus on disciplining rather than trying to understand children. So until that changes, fortunately, it can look like, to people who want to look at it that way, that bad parenting, their perception of bad parenting, it can cause the autistic. Because if the person then says, "Oh, my child's autistic," they're going, well, they're just being badly behaved. And is that what autism means? That they're just being badly behaved? That's not the case whatsoever. And let's have a look at the 10th and final myth. So the 10th myth is that autistic children are more violent, and I think that links into the previous one. And again, I think this comes down to meltdowns and how they can look aggressive and violent when they are not in nature. Studies show that autistic children are no more violent than neurotypical children, but are more likely to become overwhelmed and react in a way that could be perceived as aggressive or violent, even if it's not actually true violence, as in they're being violent. It might feel that way because the reaction it seems extreme to people, but that doesn't mean that they are actually trying to be violent. It's just that it looks violence. It's violent, but violence is very different. So violence is a thought process to do something, or getting angry and losing your temper because you can't get your own way, or because of a situation that's outside of you, and you is actively trying to hurt somebody usually, or hurt or break something. And that's not what it's like when you're having a meltdown. Having a meltdown, it just is happenstance that things do get broken in those situations with children when they're having a meltdown. But it's not the primary side of it is not aggression or violence. It is frustration. That's where it's coming. Anecdotally as well, I was terrible at hiding my massive frustration after being hit and hit and hit over and over and over again, and would eventually lash out. And this would be after days of being hit and being bullied. And I didn't know to, apparently, the way neurotypical people would do it, would hide it. And that's what they were doing. They were hiding it as they were doing this from teachers and from people around me. I would lash out when it became too overwhelming for me, without any consideration of the fact that it had got to a point where I was the sensory overload was too much. I wasn't necessarily violent. I don't remember ever hitting somebody. I remember getting hit and never hitting back. I don't remember ever hitting somebody, but I remember shouting and slamming my hands on the table and maybe throwing things and pushing things across the table or onto the floor and things like that, which could have looked like violence or aggression. And actually it wasn't. It was frustration from the fact that this had been going on for so long for me, and I've been holding it in for so long. But because I did it so outwardly, I was usually the one that got into trouble for it. And anecdotally, I know that happened to a lot of autistic people when they were younger. So again, it comes down to perception, and a lot of these myths come down to either a perception or a fear, or or something that's been told to somebody, or a biased thought process, or an individualistic thought process of this is my only experience of autism, therefore everybody who is autistic must be like this. So you've got a cognitive dissonance situation going on there, that you can't separate the two things out. That your original understanding of autism from your own experience of it, to when somebody's standing in front of you and explaining their experience of it, so unable to be able to hold the two things in your head at the same time. So there are 10 myths. Like I say, there's probably many more, but I just wanted to do one on this because it was in my head around myths, and the vaccination side of it was in my head as well for some reason. And I think maybe what's going on politically at the moment has kind of made me think a lot about misinformation. So this is this I think was just in my head and needed to come out, so that's why I decided to do this one. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have, please drop a comment. I always like people to leave a comment about things and how you feel about this, what myths you think should be more highlighted to people. And if you could also do all of the other algorithm lovely things and do sharing and subscribing and liking and all those kind of things, that would be perfect. But don't worry too much about it. Thank you very much, and I hope you have a lovely rest of the day. Thank you. Bye.